Hi, I'm Manny Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington Realtors legal hotline lawyer, and today's video is another in our ongoing series entitled Winning the Offer Battle Without Losing the War. And today's topic focuses on delayed seller possession. Buyers sometimes think that their offer will be selected if they can give the seller the right to, retain possession of the property for 4 weeks, 6 weeks, some crazy number of weeks after closing, and they'll even do this without charging the seller rent, right? It's the pick me offer. What do I have to do, seller, to entice you to pick my offer? And so they give this crazy delayed possession opportunity to seller. Buyer brokers, if your buyers want to do that, okay, it's their offer. Your job is to make sure they understand the risks associated with that. When a buyer allows a seller to retain possession after closing, the buyer becomes the seller's landlord. And although there is a provision in the purchase and sale agreement that says that seller has an obligation to maintain the condition of the property until the time that buyer takes possession, it doesn't say until the date of closing, it says until the time that buyer takes possession. Notwithstanding that contractual provision, there's also a Washington law, the Residential Landlord-Tenant Act, that controls this situation. And the Washington Residential Landlord-Tenant Act has an unwaivable provision that says landlord has a duty to maintain the property in a certain level of condition, including repairing and replacing appliances that break, repairing and replacing mechanical systems that break. Think about the furnace, think about the hot water heater. So we've got a seller living in the property 2 weeks after closing, the furnace goes out. Buyer hasn't even taken possession yet, the furnace goes out. Whose obligation is it, whose cost is it to replace that or repair or replace that furnace? Under Washington law, it's the buyer's responsibility. Buyer brokers, your buyer should never become a landlord without a complete and full understanding of the obligations that come along with being a landlord. They may have the obligation to replace the furnace in a house that they've never occupied and for which they are receiving no rent. Now, if that's what it takes to be the winning bid in a competitive offer situation, so be it. That's the buyer's choice to make an offer like that. Make sure you have properly educated and advised your buyer to seek legal counsel in this case. Buyer, before you write this offer, I strongly encourage you to seek the advice of legal counsel with respect to what your obligation will be as the landlord for seller's property occupied by seller. If your buyer doesn't want to go talk to their lawyer, so be it. But you put in writing your advice to the buyer to seek legal counsel before they undertook an obligation to be seller's landlord. What about a scenario where seller has the right to delayed possession and then seller doesn't move out? Your buyer may have to evict seller. Make sure your buyer understands the consequences of having to evict a seller or any occupant, tenant, from property. It's expensive and it's time consuming. Buyer, I encourage you to seek legal counsel with respect to all aspects of being a landlord, including your duties under the Landlord-Tenant Act and the obligation to evict the seller should the seller not move out in a timely manner. Particularly a seller who's living there rent-free. And if seller's living there rent-free and doesn't move out when they're required to move out, your buyer may have a tough time collecting damages for the loss of rental value for the time that the seller was living in the property, since the seller never had an obligation to pay rent in the first place. Again, all aspects of a very dynamic situation triggered by the fact that buyer gave seller delayed and oftentimes substantially delayed possession of the property that buyer now owns. If your buyer wants to do that, make sure you have properly protected yourself and your firm by educating the buyer as to the risks of giving seller that delayed possession, educating your buyer in writing, and in this case particularly, advising the buyer in writing to seek legal counsel. If you have questions on this topic or any other related to buyer competitive offers or anything that you encounter in your real estate life, send an email to me, legalhotline@warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington Realtors member.